mankind is constantly striving to develop and grow. However, advances in technology and standards of living are not without a price. Often, due to negligence, ignorance, or just as a result of an accident, disasters can occur which devastate the environment and end lives. Here are my choices for 5 of the worst man-made disasters that caused huge environmental destruction and inflicted terrible suffering on the people affected by them. Number 5. The Great Smog of London. Also known as the Big Smoke, the Great Smog of London was the worst air pollution event in the history of the UK and is estimated to have killed at least 4,000 people, causing a further 100,000 illnesses. An unusually cold period of weather descended on London in December 1952, and Londoners were forced to burn more coal than usual to keep warm. The coal used tended to be low grade and produced a large amount of sulfur dioxide when burned. This increase in coal use, combined with already heavy pollution from industry, was made worse by weather conditions which caused air above the surface to be warmer than air at ground level, which prevented smoke from rising, causing it to mix with fog. With no wind to disperse the pollution, a 30-mile wide poisonous smog settled over the city. In some areas, visibility fell below 1 meter, with some people unable to see as far as their feet when walking. The smog was so thick that it even seeped indoors, and crime shot up as criminals were able to easily disappear into the fog and escape. Most public transport was shut down, and ambulances were forced out of service. In some areas, even movie screenings were cancelled, as visibility in large indoor spaces was so poor that the screen could not be seen. The noxious yellow smog lasted for around 5 days, before dispersing when the weather finally changed. In the following weeks, government reports estimated that around 4,000 people had died during the 5-day period, with over 100,000 more falling seriously ill. Recent studies estimate that these figures may have been too low, and put the death count at closer to a staggering 12,000. The terrible effects of the smog shocked the country and led to major changes in regulations. The use of dirty fuels was heavily restricted, and financial incentives were offered to residents in an effort to encourage them to replace coal fires with alternative heating methods. Number 4. The Aral Sea. Located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the Aral Sea was once the 4th largest lake in the world. In one of the most dramatic man-made alterations to the Earth's surface, the Aral Sea began shrinking in the 1960s after the rivers which fed into it were diverted, and it has now shrunk to just 10% of its original size. Satellite images shockingly demonstrate the scale of this change, and vast areas that used to lay underwater are now desert. The region's once thriving fishing industry has been decimated, leading to economic hardship and reducing former fishing towns to ship graveyards. The demise of the Aral Sea began in the 1960s, when the Soviet government decided that the 2 rivers feeding into the Aral Sea would be diverted so as to irrigate the surrounding desert in an effort to grow cotton and other crops in the region. The thousands of miles of irrigation canals were poorly built, and as much as 75% of the water diverted from the rivers was wasted before even reaching the crops through leaks and evaporation. Crop rotation was not used by farmers, and the depleted soil required enormous amounts of pesticides and fertilizers to maintain production. These chemicals would find their way back into the Aral Sea, causing terrible pollution. As the seawater retreated, large sections of the polluted lakebed were exposed to the air, with winds carrying its toxic dust to the surrounding areas. People living nearby are now plagued with health problems, including high rates of cancer, respiratory illnesses, and infectious diseases. The fatality rate is abnormally high amongst those living in the area, with the mortality rate as high as 75 in every 1,000 newborn babies, 3 times higher than the national average in Kazakhstan. As if this wasn't bad enough, an island which used to lay in the middle of the lake and was the site of Soviet bio-warfare experimentation has now become part of the mainland because of the shrinking water level. The island was used for open-air experiments with anthrax and plague, and although the site was supposed to have been cleaned up in 2001, the area is still littered with old equipment and crawling with looters, and with anthrax notoriously difficult to clean up, many believe that the island still contains hidden dangers. Number 3. The Piper Alpha oil rig disaster. Piper Alpha was an oil platform located in the North Sea, off the coast of Scotland, and was producing around 300,000 barrels of oil per day at its peak. On the 6th of July 1988, the platform was destroyed as a result of a giant explosion and the multiple fires that followed. 167 of the 228 workers were killed, either dying in the explosion and fires, or drowning while attempting to escape. By the time the fires were brought under control 3 weeks later, the platform was all but gone. The damage caused by the disaster was estimated to be a staggering $3.4 billion, and it's remembered as the worst offshore oil disaster in history. Due to the platform being destroyed, and the fact that many of those involved died in the disaster, the full story regarding what transpired is still disputed. The official report has been questioned by many of the workers who witnessed the events. However, the accident seems to have been largely caused by human error. The safety valve on one of the 2 pumps had failed and been replaced with a temporary cover. The pump should have remained out of use, however it seems as though lack of communication meant that the pump was turned back on by the night crew, who were unaware that the safety valve was missing. Once the faulty pump had been activated, it began leaking gas, which quickly ignited and exploded, tearing through fire safety panels which were not designed to contain explosions. Many of the workers would have died instantly, however more destruction was to follow. With the fire safety panels destroyed, the fire rapidly spread and the control room was abandoned. For many of the workers, the route to the lifeboats was blocked by fire, so they made their way to the fireproofed accommodation block to await further instructions. The fire prevented any rescue helicopter landings, and the men received no further instructions, all while smoke began to creep into the accommodation block. The fire continued to grow as it was being fed with fresh fuel from the damaged pipes, and at 10:20 p.m, a gas line melted and burst, releasing up to 30 tons of gas per second into the fire. By 10:50 p.m, a second gas line ruptured, adding millions of cubic feet of gas into the already raging fire. The heat produced was so intense that machinery and steel began to melt. Anyone who could leapt into the sea in an effort to escape the intense heat of the fire, and incredibly 61 workers survived. By 11:50 p.m, the fireproofed accommodation block collapsed into the sea, and by 12:45 a.m, most of the platform had been destroyed. The resulting public inquiry into the disaster led to 106 recommendations being made for changes to North Sea safety procedures, however no criminal charges were brought against the rig's operator, Occidental. Number 2. The Bhopal Disaster. The Bhopal disaster occurred in India on the night of the 2nd of December 1984 and is considered the world's worst industrial disaster. Over 500,000 people were exposed to a toxic gas leak, resulting in at least 8,000 deaths and nearly 500,000 injuries. The exact cause of the disaster is still hotly debated. The Indian government blames poor management and maintenance at the plant, while others suggest that the disaster may have been the result of an act of sabotage. According to government investigators, a faulty valve on one of the gas storage tanks had allowed water which was supposed to be used to clean internal pipes to mix with MIC gas. The resulting chemical reaction caused a build-up of pressure and heat, however the cooling unit failed to activate as it had been drained of its coolant. At roughly 1 a.m. on December the 3rd, the build-up of pressure caused the safety valve to give way, releasing the deadly MIC gas into the air. The toxic gas drifted into densely populated areas near the chemical plant, killing and injuring hundreds of thousands of people. Panic quickly spread as thousands attempted to flee the path of the poisonous gas, and many residents were only made aware of the leak when they left their homes to investigate the commotion. The gas began causing the throats and eyes of anyone exposed to burn, and many were killed through suffocation. The local healthcare service was quickly overwhelmed, and even those lucky enough to escape with their lives were not left unscathed. Survivors experienced a mixture of symptoms, including blindness, cancer, and brain damage. Many women would also go on to give birth to physically and mentally disabled children. To add insult to injury, most survivors were only awarded a few $100s as compensation for their suffering, and in June 2010, 7 ex-employees of the company, including the former chairman, were convicted of causing death by negligence and given just 2 years in prison. The story does not end there, however, as the area has yet to be properly decontaminated, and an estimated 400 tons of industrial waste is still present at the site of the plant. Water contamination in the area has been blamed for further severe health problems, and people living in the area continue to experience high occurrences of birth defects amongst newborn babies. Number 1. Chernobyl. On the 26th of April 1986, workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant began a routine systems test at reactor number 4. While testing the core cooling system, there was an unexpected power surge which caused a reactor vessel to rupture and resulted in several steam explosions. These explosions caused the exposure of the reactor's graphite to air, causing a fire which lasted for 10 days. The fire sent a huge plume of radiation into the environment, and it's estimated that the disaster released 400 times more radioactive material than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. 31 reactor staff and emergency workers died during the disaster, and some estimates placed the potential long-term death toll in the tens of thousands, with those exposed to radiation facing increased instances of cancer and birth defects. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the power plant, and 120,000 people were evacuated from the area, including all 50,000 residents of Pripyat, which was the town which housed workers at Chernobyl and was only 3 kilometers away from the disaster. The effort to contain the contamination involved 500,000 workers and cost $15 billion, making the Chernobyl disaster the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. The fire was eventually extinguished, and by December 1986, a concrete shell had been built to seal off the reactor in an effort to prevent any more radioactive material from entering the atmosphere. However, these measures were too late for those who had faced the fire head-on. Many had been sent into the plant with little or no protection and were exposed to massive levels of radiation. The investigation into the accident that followed placed blame on a flawed reactor design combined with mistakes made by poorly trained personnel. The workers' city of Pripyat remains an abandoned and decaying ghost town, and the area around the Chernobyl plant could be unfit for human habitation for up to 20,000 years. So those are my choices for 5 of the worst man-made disasters. Let me know what you think and what you would have included in the list in the comments below, and I'll see you again on the next video.